The only real difference at even the Olympic level comes down to that mental skill at the end. And I feel like if you have 100 people in the room and you talk to them about mental skills, I think a huge portion of them may think it's a little bit hocus pocus.
Hey guys, Dave Lowshelter, Dad Bod Judo. It's our podcast. Hey, I got a nice special guest here today. One of my good friends, Sam Dobbs, Sam Lucky Dobbs. Hey Sam, what's going on, man? We're going to talk about judo today. We're going to talk about jiu-jitsu. Sam is a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. He also trains some judo, and he's been doing this for quite a while. And I got him on the podcast. I'm really excited. So, what are we going to talk about today, man?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say, Dave, thank you so much for having me on. I've been really anticipating this. And as you know from our brief conversations before, I always love to talk to you because you're a very wise and worldly person. And I see you as one of my mentors in the martial arts world. So it is really good to be here.
No, so I appreciate that, man. I really do. That's really cool to hear.
Yeah.
Hey, man, we've had a lot of conversations so far, and we want to put this out to the world here. And I think some of the things we kind of talked about was some of the mental game, some of the philosophies of training and
Hmm.
the sport of jiu-jitsu and judo and the similarities and differences. So, man, I want to pick your brain a little bit and get some
Sure.
ideas on what you got, because I know you got a whole bunch of stuff to offer. So I'm just really curious. So what do you want to start with?
So, I mean, first of all, I just want to say that I think in any endeavor, sport, or whatever domain you're involved in, I always feel like there's four pillars of development in a sense. There's always the technical, the tactical, the physical, and the psychological. And I feel like by default, no matter which area you go into, there's always a technical element that's always built in. There's always a tactical element that's built in, and there's always a physical element that's built in, just by definition of walking through the doors. So if you go to judo, those things are shown because you're showing a technique, you're showing how to get to that technique, and then there's warm-ups and stuff to get the physical. But I feel like the area of sport and other things in life that is hugely underutilized is the psychological aspect, or the mental skills, or the soft skills of the sport. And I feel like, when you have two athletes that are equal in technique, tactics, and physics, the only real difference at even the Olympic level comes down to that mental skill at the end. And I feel like if you have 100 people in the room and you talk to them about mental skills, I think a huge portion of them may think it's a little bit hocus pocus and tend to not go down that route. But the people that do and understand it can see a huge benefit in their overall game, because I feel like the psychological can help drive forward the other three aspects of anything that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I've interviewed a few Olympians on this podcast, and that was the one thing I always wanted to kind of pick their brain about was, what's going through their mind. 'Cause, you get to a certain level, it's like everybody's about the same. They all train about the same. Everybody's in shape. Everybody has a lot of years of experience under their belt, and it really comes down to that mental game where it's like, okay, what's really going? The edge comes in, where it's like, okay, how do you think? What do you say to yourself? How do you feel? How do you prepare yourself? Where's the confidence? And Jason Morris, he was a four-time Olympian. I
Hmm.
interviewed him and I asked him the same question: what gives you the most confidence? Or what was the difference between like an Olympic athlete and someone who isn't? And he just was like very terse, and he said it's prep. It's all about the prep. Like the confidence comes with preparation. And I was like, oh yeah, well that kind of makes sense. Like if you really prepare correctly. And yeah, we talked about off just before we got on this
Hmm.
podcast, we talked about our friend. He's going to the jiu-jitsu worlds, and like his prep is like so specific. Everything, his nutrition, his training, every hour is accounted for. And so when he gets there, he's a two-time world champion already. And the reason he's a two-time world champion is I'm assuming is because like his preparation's so good. So I think part of that too is like the mental game is coming from like, okay, how do I prepare for this mentally and physically? So when I get to that point in competition or practice, I'm able to kind of deliver, with a lot, with the utmost confidence and
Hmm.
belief that I can do this. And and that's where the muscle memory comes in too with the reps. So I think it's so important. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's something that, I do for a living with, being a clinician as
Hmm.
well. Is it's all about, like, what do you say to yourself? How do you get, what type of belief do you have? What do you say to yourself? How do you feel about it? How do you act upon it? All that stuff. So yeah, I think I agree.
Andre, last year I did a training camp with him, and for the Worlds, I competed myself at the Worlds. It was my first year. But what I noticed about Andre last year was you're 100% right. He would always go back and say, repeat the same thing. When I'm 100% prepared, I walk into the arena feeling more confident because the adrenaline in the room, if you've got 10,000 competitors and there's a lot of stuff going on, it's almost like paying your taxes. There's a little bit of that energy and preparation gets taken away because of the pageantry of the event. And if you're not in peak position to feel good, that's when people start to gas out, hyperventilate, start to doubt themselves. And he's definitely said, he said one of the biggest things that was successful for him was being physically, mentally ready and knowing that his confidence level was good through his preparation. And Andre, believe me, he has everything calculated, very, very calculated person, just basically a real professional. And I can give you the opposite side to that story. I think it was 14 years ago, maybe 15 now. I was going for the championship of the Golden Gloves, and I was going to be fighting down at the getaway. And I remember that day. Um, Physically I was ready, but mentally I wasn't ready. And I remember pacing around my house about 3 hours before the show, and I remember my self-talk was, I want to get this over and done with. I can't. I kept saying I kind of can't be bothered. And this was a little voice, but I never really was aware of it. This is hindsight thinking, and I kind of just like, all right, it's raining outside, so I went down to the arena and I checked in and everything and went through all the normal preparations 2 hours before the fight. You sign in, get your hands wrapped. Now you know your fight's about 3 fights away, and then you hit this like peak anxiety phase, and then you get to the point where you're up, you're on deck, and now you start going through the just going to the ring, and you get in the ring, and now it's like a fight or flight mechanism. You're here now. But I remember to this day thinking to myself, I actually lost that fight that night. And it was a really, really close decision, but I felt like the guy was called Josh Minios from the North Side. Great, great kid, good boxer, younger than me, but he was just a little bit more active. And if you said to me right now, I was stronger than him, and I believe in my heart I should have beat him, but he was mentally stronger that night. And I remember after thinking to myself, you didn't want it. You were strong. You were stronger physically. I was a bigger guy. I was probably just as fit as him, but the difference in the ring that night was I lost that fight because of my mental preparation and I wasn't strong enough. And what it came down to was the self talk.
Hmm.
The self talk was telling me I want to get this over and done with, instead of using the self talk to embrace the moment. And the difference between my boxing career, which wasn't nothing special, I fought 6 times in the Golden Gloves as a 29, 30-year-old man. But the difference between my experience with boxing and my experience with jiu-jitsu now is my mental preparation is so different.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. The self-talk means everything. Because it's like, because if you look at a cognitive behavioral model,
Hmm.
it's your belief that you start with a belief, right? I can do this,
Hmm.
and that's a deep seated thing that's there, and then from there, there's the self talk where there's this imagery, and self talk. Where you're going to be, what you're saying to yourself. It's like, I will do this. I can do this. I'm able to, and that type of thing. Will that mantra does help because that
Yes.
triggers an emotion of, because what you say to yourself, I want to get it over with. Well, that's kind of a limiting kind of self talk where it's kind of like it's draining you, right? But it's
Yes.
like you're like, okay, well, this is going to happen. I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to win this, or whatever that self talk is. That generates an emotion that's very motivating, and if it's a happy, excited, whatever that would be, in a positive way, that desire. then your behavior is going to follow that, where
Right.
you're going to act upon that. And so like, you can do a couple different things. You can also change it where, instead of, you can actually take the action and reverse it and say, okay, it can act as if you're going to win. Like you're gonna, use your body, you're gonna stand, you're gonna breathe, you're gonna put yourself in a state where it's like, hey man, this is gonna happen. And that'll also generate an emotion the other way too. So you can also do the self-talk one way and also generate that with your physiology the other way, and act that you're confident and you want this.
Yep.
And that generate that emotion and that behavior that was like, okay, this is going to happen. That energy will be there. So it's kind of a dual trick in a sense, and it's kind of a tricky way. It takes practice. Again,
Sure.
and so I think that's kind of the fun way to to train athletes. You can train them physically, um, but kind of getting back to like preparation. The preparation does start with the mental for it's because it takes time to train yourself that way, right? So
Yes.
it's like there's time involved. So you have to be able to kind of like train yourself mentally and physically at the same time, simultaneous to that, where then you're able to say, okay, I'm now ready both mentally, because you can be super fit,
Yes.
super ready, but if you're, like you said, if your mind's not into it, you don't, I mean, you don't got the eye of the tiger. I mean, it's like the Rocky film,
Right.
right? It's like, Rocky lost in the Rocky 3. He didn't have the eye of the tiger. Apollo created to come in and say, look, you got to get that back. You'd have to go back to the beginning, and you got to, it's a fictional character, but it's the same idea. The
Sure.
psychology is the same. So yeah, it's really fascinating. I think also the one thing that drives me like crazy in terms of preparation is when people cut weight and they kind of wait till like 2 weeks out and say, well, I have to cut like, 7 kilos. It's like, well, you know what? You knew about this tournament like in January, and now
Hmm.
it's like May. It's like, when did you want to start cutting weight? And so what drives me absolutely nuts is when somebody says, well, I'm going to drop the weight, and they do it within like, a week, and it's like, and they drain themselves, and it's like, well, you've just wasted like your entire training, because now you're drained to the max. And I know there's a philosophy of like, I'll cut down and I'll gain the weight back the next day, and I get that, and we've all done that. But I think there's a part of it too where it's like, if you do it incrementally and you think about, okay, it's January and nationals are in April or whatever. Like when I was competing, it was in April. So
Hmm.
it was usually like the third week of April. So I would start my weight cutting in January, and I would count the weeks. I would say, well, how many pounds do I need to lose, and what do I need to do between January and that, and and there's a strategy. Like, okay, well, that's a pound a week. Okay, well, if there's 8 weeks or whatever, or how many weeks there would be between the tournament whenever you start cutting, well, you can do that incrementally. And then when
Sure.
you get to the tournament, if you want to cut a few pounds like right before, that's great. But you're not going to cut like, 8 pounds. It's going to be like maybe a couple, and you're still good. So I think the preparation goes in intelligently, where you're going to be in cutting weights, an example, right? Where you're going to play that out, and you're going to divide it out and see, okay, what do I need to do between this day and this day? And when do I start? And when's the actual goal? When's the competition? When's whatever? Like a term paper. You start the night before. Some people can write a term paper and get an A. Some people can't.
Right.
I certainly could not. I had to do weeks ahead of time because I had people
Yeah.
revise it and stuff like that. That's where true success comes in, because then you're able to kind of like, play with it. Uh,
Sure.
so I think preparation is kind of a good way of kind of like starting this conversation, because I think that like once you realize like it's a process and you have a plan and you have a
Yes.
strategy, then it's a heck of a lot easier to be successful at the end, because now you're actually ready. Going back to like prep, like Jason Moore said, it's all about the prep. So it kind of brings it full circle. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And just to your point, there's a thing called my coach was just telling me the other day. There's reality, and then there's perception,
Hmm.
and he said the space in between those two things is a problem. He
Yeah.
said when your perception and reality's here, you're going to know that if you've got 8 weeks, every week, like Andre, every hour, every week, every moment is chopped up into little chunks so that you can manage it in a non-stressful way so that you can have peak performance when you do your periodization. You want to peak up to the
Hmm.
point. Whereas the guys that are crammers, they leave it to the last minute. They're a little bit disconnected with reality in a sense.
Hmm.
For whatever reason, I mean, I'm sure there's many reasons for that, but what happens is they end up being super stressed because they're eating the whole pie near the time, and now their body can't even process a lot of the things that they do. And more times than not, unless you're an outlier, we know there's some people like that could show up with 6 beers in them and go win a tournament. There are outlier. There are outliers out there, and this is not a black and white thing. But for most people, if you don't prepare properly, you're probably going to get equal results back.
Yeah.
And then you're also depending on the competition not being good. You're hoping for the competition to beat themselves by being less prepared than you.
Hey man, let me switch gears a little bit because I know the one thing that we talked about the other day was like the pedagogy of teaching
Hmm.
and training, and you were mentioning some things about that, and you were kind of really excited about that. So let me get some
Sure.
ideas about that. What's your philosophy on that?
On coaching people.
Yeah, like
So
teaching, coaching, what type of things that kind of make it work. What's worked for
so
you, what's worked for others.
when I first started coaching, I mean, I just thought you just threw mud at the wall and see what stuck, and you just went on and regurgitated what the next person said. And then I started to realize that, when you're dealing with people, and I know that this is a field that you're very aware of, um, did people have different learning styles? Um, some people are auditory, some are kinesthetic, some are visual, some are auditory, and their modality determines how much they can learn and how quickly they can learn. And that starts with a teacher knowing what the student needs, and that would probably go with some kind of assessment. And I know that I watched one of your seminars or a training video that you did with your business. You had done this thing where you were able to do like a doctor would assess the room and see what you were dealing with. And then depending on the project that you're doing, you would pull out, maybe I need two A-type personalities, I need two B-type, and you would formulate a team to go and attack the project that you were doing. Similarly, as a soccer coach or a judo coach or a jiu-jitsu coach, you're in a room with multiple different kinds of people. And while A-type personalities may not necessarily talk about how they perceive information, it would be a similar thing. You'd want to find out who is auditory, kinesthetic, visual, and auditory, because you might need to give more information to the auditory person. You might have to give them the lesson on a piece of paper.
Hmm.
The visual person, they want to see you do the move 5 times. The guy that just needs to hear it, he's like, oh man, why is he doing this? Why is he doing 5 demonstrations?
Hmm.
I heard it the first time. So, from a coach's perspective, when you're teaching, if you can be sensitive to and know how people perceive information, and I don't think anybody's really one sided. I think people tend to be a blend, but usually there's maybe one or two dominant ones with them. Like for me, I'm very visual. I love to see. I love to see it being done, and then from there, I'm like, I'm really getting it, and I'm visualizing it later on. But if the person's more auditory later on when they go home, they really need that information to connect the dots. And I think to maximize the learning, it's good to understand and do a diagnosis on the style of people you're dealing with. And whenever I was doing my soccer courses and stuff, they told us that you have to be able to say one thing in the 4 or 5 different ways
Hmm.
so that you are touching the whole room.
Hmm.
Because if somebody's learning style is A and you're doing it in C, they will disengage and find it quite boring. And that leads into the flow and Mihai Giuseppe high, overstimulated, understimulated, bored. That can lead to those things. And you can have a thing called losing the locker room.
Hmm.
But if you can keep everybody engaged and say it in a way that maybe you start off by doing a chalk talk and you do the diagram on the board and you write down the 3 steps, and then you take it to the stage where you do the visual, and then at the end you maybe do a, hey, what did we just learn today? And if you can sort of, and it's very hard to do, believe me, because our structure of classes today are very, sort of cookie cutter type. But
Mhm.
if you can get that structure set up, I think more people would be engaged and everybody would get to learn a little bit more efficient at their own modality,
Mhm.
and get a little bit more out of it. And I'm not saying it's a game changer, but a couple of degrees or a couple of percent either way can make a big difference in learning.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, there's different ways to show something, especially with judo, for
Mhm.
example, where there's like a whole part whole approach they call it, where
Yes.
you can show the general gist of the throw, and here's the gross motor movement of this. Okay, here's what you do. Then you can start taking it apart. Okay, like that's so let's look at the hands and where the arms are. Now let's look where the hips are. Let's you kind of like you take a spotlight on each individual part of the throw or the body and positioning, and then you train that. So okay, now just think about just your hands when you do this. Okay, you did the general gist, you did the
Hmm.
throw, your
Hmm.
big body movement, you turning this way and throwing. Now let's talk about the hands. They get more detail. How do you use your hands? How do you pull? Then okay, where do the hips belong? How about your legs? Let's talk about where your feet should be and your knees and everything else. Then you go back to the whole part. Now let's put it all together. Now let's talk about now think about now the hands, hips, and legs, and now you kind of at the end of that lesson you can put it all together. That's kind of general way you can teach a throw,
Yes.
and you probably do that in jujitsu as well, and almost any sport if you think about it. So it's like
Absolutely.
a whole approach, which is kind of a nice way to learn because then it's like okay, what are you trying to get at? Um, the one thing that I also added to the my teaching, I learned from Neil Adams, where it's so he calls it a frame, like
Hmm.
a frame of the throw, like where you need to be to actually execute the throw. Like what's your frame of them going over your hips or your leg or what your whatever. I really like that because it's like it teaches you how to like land in that position to be able to go to throw. Um, so it's kind of like, if you start with a frame, then you can build around the frame, which is a little different.
Hmm. Yeah.
Still whole part whole, but it's like a different perspective. It's like, okay, here's what you should be when you throw. Then you got almost like clay, where you're gonna like you have a frame of the frame, and then you start putting clay on it, and you start showing, okay, this is what you do with the hands. Here's what you do with then the movement. So it's kind of interesting how you can kind of like play with different types. To your point, those different modalities of teaching, some people get it different ways.
Sure.
I can teach so I say, here's your frame and do it this way. They go, I don't, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Just show me. It's like, okay, let me only do it this way. Let me show you how to do it. And they get the idea. And so it's kind of like a really cool way of like, then you get a whole class and then you can kind of like everybody or most of the class gets it because you're showing it in different ways. Like
Yes.
you said, is it visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? Okay, here's how it feels. Here's how it looks. Here I'm gonna tell you what it looks like,
Hmm.
what you should do, which is very powerful. And it takes time. Like
Yes.
I think the other thing too is I think instructors, the thing that's difficult for me is they kind of overlook the details and they just say, okay, just go do it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, you got to come back and got to like refine a little bit. You wouldn't like write a book and then not edit the book. Like you got to like,
Right.
it would just be a first draft. You got to be able to edit. You got to be able to fix the sentences and fix the
Yeah.
grammar. You got to like play with the writing. So because there's no really good writing, there's only good rewriting.
I like that.
Yeah, there's only good jujitsu or judo. It's re-judo. It's like you kind of
Yes.
keep refining the technique.
Mm.
And I think that to me that's really important. And I think once and I try to do that in my videos too with Dad Bod Judo. It's like get specific as possible So I'm able to, like, this is the detail. Like, you can figure out the rest type of thing, once you
Right.
practice. So
I have actually got experience with a whole part whole method. So how we would do it in soccer would be I would lay out a scenario. Okay, we're going to do 3v3 in soccer, and I would let them play.
mm,
Then I look for the issue. Then I take them and I do the part where I do the technical breakdown and say, this
mhm,
is how we do it. And then by the end of practice, you put them back into the game again and you see where the improvement was with the new level of understanding. Now, in a judo or jiu-jitsu setting, how I would translate that in would be the beginning of class would be, okay, guys, get into your kinki otsu or iatsu position. We're going to do randori. Your goal is to off balance him. Your goal is to off balance him, and just give them general guidelines and do a clock, 5 minutes, and then you walk around the room and observe to see what if the topic of your day is there, or if there's a general theme in the room going wrong. Then you say, okay, guys, bring it in. Let's talk about some of the things. What were you having trouble with? Usually, it's probably going to be something to do with, like, I couldn't get past the stiff arms or whatever. And
mhm.
then what you do is you give them some techniques, break it down. This is how you break the arm. You send them back to randori. You look to see if there's getting little tiny improvement. You keep doing the whole part whole, and at the end of the class, you should start to identify as the coach, and they should start to identify as the student that they're starting to maybe not do the move, but they're starting to recognize the grip and starting to. And then if you do that enough, you really start to layer in a process of deep learning.
Hey guys, I got a new coaching system that I developed. It's called the Mind Coach System. It's a 7-step process to help you reach your peak potential. We talk about dreams, we talk about goals, we talk about strategy, we talk about execution, mindset, and then reaching your peak potential. By using all of those, we can get you there, and we can develop a plan for you to be able to find your goals and to reach those and reach your peak potential. So click the link below, check it out, contact me, and then we can go from there. So yeah, man, I mean, learning how to do or how to train, how to learn different techniques and things like that. I think there's art. I mean, obviously there's an art form to it, any type of teaching. And really, it's like the end of the ham. The problem with, like, teaching is, there's a lot of we talk about pedagogy, talking about, learning and education and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And there's so many different styles and different ways of training someone to do something.
Yes.
And I think in my part, since I'm not competing anymore, I'm older, and I'm more, I like to exercise and train,
Mm-hmm.
and but I also like to, I want to give back, but I want to hone in on those skills of, like, how to teach somebody. And like you said, what's their learning style? What do they really need? How do you communicate that where it's effective, where they can get it? And I think, like, studying this type of thing and being creative with it is also pretty important as well, because, you got to have fun with it. And like I said, like, it's like the end of the ham, like the story, the end of the ham, where, the guy comes home, it was, we're going to have a ham, and they would cut the end of the ham off. And it was like, well, why do you cut the end of the ham off? Well, my mama cuts the end of the ham off. Well, mama's back in the kitchen, says, Mama. He goes, why do you cut the end of the ham off? He goes, because my mama cut the end of the ham off. He's like, well, let's call up grandma and see what's up. Hey, grandma, why did you cut the end of the ham off? She goes, I cut the end of the ham off because my roaster was too small. So she had a reason, but they generationally would just do the same thing. And I think we do the same thing
Right.
with teaching, is we learn from our teacher and they learn from their teacher, and you kind of learn the same way of teaching, but it never changes until you actually stop and study it and kind of pull it apart and use some science, put some science into it. This is the way, this is a really good way to do it. And you got to be, like I said, it's an art and a science. So I think that's two things that we have to kind of focus on as instructors, or as, teachers, to be able to do that.
Absolutely. That's a great analogy about the ham for sure. That sort of makes you feel like there's a best. I think in sport and stuff, there's a best practices. I know in soccer they have a thing called best practices, and then
Mhm.
from best practices, then you add in what's necessary. For instance, there might be a note on if you were making that ham, there might be a note saying if ham is too big for the tray, you can cut the end off.
Yeah.
It's more of an add-on in the moment as opposed to an absolute.
Mm-hmm.
But the best practices is you put the ham in a tray. If the tray is too small, you cut a little bit of the ham off, whatever. But I think if you go with best practices, but I think also what you just described is takes a lot of the science. You have to track and trend,
Mm-hmm.
because I think equally there's people that have been doing the wrong thing for years and years and years and getting the complete opposite results to what they wanted to. So
Mm-hmm.
they've been doing an art and science of how to go in the wrong direction per se, like in necessarily, but I feel like it takes a little bit of data, a little bit of analysis to see if you're starting to get the desired result, so that you can keep adding in more of the same with all the elements that we just talked about the learning styles and everything like that. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think, from the psychological piece, focusing in on that, and then focusing on like how to teach, how to learn, how does someone learn? How does someone like grasp the concepts? How do you make them mentally tough? Things like that. That's all in the mix. And I think
Right.
if you don't have all of it in the mix, in that curriculum, you're gonna miss something. So you gotta inculcate like all that, the mental game, how to do that. And you could do that many different ways. I mean, it takes. It's not like you're gonna lecture somebody and like brainwash them. There's
Right.
many ways to build confidence, right? And that's where the creativity comes in too. But it's based off something. You have to base it off that. You just can't just like guess. It's like, oh, let me just try this. Well, if you're going to do that, then at least learn from your mistakes and then
Sure.
continue to kind of build that. Because I think that's really important. I think that's something that, if as coaches, if we don't do that,
Hmm.
uh, we're remiss in our responsibilities of kind of building someone's skills, and even building someone's career in a sense. Because I also think, like with my son, he's 11, but to
Hmm.
give him the exposure of different instructors early on, because I had that. I was exposed to many different instructors, which I got a
Yeah.
lot of looks in judo, and you find your own style. You find people that you like their style, you like their techniques, and you can model that. So you have
Yeah.
different models and different training. It's not just like one person that teaches this one way. It's not like a Mr. Miyagi
Right.
teaching Danielson, how to paint the fence, and that's it. You can get a lot of different looks. You got to travel, you got to see different things, you got to train with different people, and once you do that, then you'll be able to kind of blossom your skills, because now and you can learn faster that way too, because then you can see more. If you go to Europe, you're gonna see how they live. You go to Japan, see how they live. Different cultures, different food, different behaviors, and you become more worldly. I think in
Yes.
that sense too. You're not so myopically into one thing. If this is the way we do it. It's a problem with business, right? We've always done it this way. That's a recipe for disaster. I mean, if you
Hmm.
you want to end up losing, I mean, in a business or in a match or in life, do it the same way over and over again for a long period of time. Guess what? You're going to lose. You got
Right.
to be able to open your mind up a little bit too. So,
I can definitely relate to what you just said there about having multiple instructors, just by the nature of my job. I'm a boilermaker by trade in the unions, but now I'm a supervisor, and I go into nuclear stations around the country and supervise multi-million-dollar projects. But while I travel, I go to different jiu-jitsu gyms around the country. And for the last 5 years, I've had so many different influences on me with my style of jiu-jitsu. And to give you an example, like, so say I went to New Jersey to work, and I went to the gym down the street, and I'm there for 6 weeks. I go in there with my style, and then I go in there, and for the first like 2 or 3 weeks, I'm lost,
mhm,
because they have a different style and a different take, and there may be more ground. Some places are more wrestling, some places are more takedowns. But then by the time I leave after 6 weeks, I'm kind of like starting to give their guys more trouble and sort of level up. But then what happens is that I come home, and then I got to get readjusted to my environment again. And
mhm,
then this happens to me twice a year. But for the last 5 years, the interesting thing was it kept me in a place where I was always adapting. And it's kind of like the whole like you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable.
mhm.
And when you're in that uncomfortable being uncomfortable stage, initially it seems like you might not be getting anywhere with it. But then eventually you start to have all this pool of resources and knowledge, and then that's where you really can bake your own cake as far as your own style, because you're not just doing, like, to your point, the Miyagi with, paint the fence, this is the only way. You're getting, you can take a little bit of an ingredient from all the places you've got and then see where that fits into your personality and learning style. And I think that can be so much more valuable, but might not necessarily be the most comfortable route. But I'm not choosing to go to new places. It's just circumstance and work. I'm making the best of the situation. It just so happens that long term, I think it's, to your point, I think it has added to my knowledge base and my experience in jiu-jitsu. I think that the guys that stayed home in one place are probably more specialized in their style. But again, they're, like you said, they maybe think that they have the whole package. When I see further afield and I have more knowledge to pull from, and I might not be quite at the same level yet, but eventually all that knowledge, travel, and different coaching eventually adds up to something later on when you go for the long term gradual development overall.
Yeah, and in that case too, I mean, 2 and 2 make 5 because you have so many reference points. Then
Right.
you can start connecting things that are related, and it's like,
Right.
"Oh, okay, well, that relates to this." And then you start relating things, is a
Mm-hmm.
heck of a lot easier. I had a client, he was like, "Look," he goes, "Dave, I'm not really good with conversation, and I really don't know what to say," and he's dating these girls, he's in these social events, and he's kind of he's introverted type of guy, and he goes, "Well, how do you do that?" Or
Mm-hmm.
and I told him, I'm like, "Look," I said, "when you get a little bit older, it's a little bit easier, because you have more reference points and you can pull from different things, but you can still
Mm-hmm.
do it no matter what. It's a skill that you develop." And so what I told him was, I was like, "Listen, if you're talking about something, you want things to link, and you're going to link things together, and that's how you make a conversation. The,
Yeah.
the the people that I know that can just keep talking extemporaneously, or the ones that just keep linking things together." And so, I told him, I'm like, there was a time where I was a manager years ago, and I was promoted. I was a supervisor, then a manager, and the director of a program, and I always had to use big staff meetings, and I was responsible for doing these meetings, and I was petrified. I was terrified.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had these no, I have 2 pages of notes. It was like, 9 font, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I just read through them. I had to fill an hour, right? And then after a while, like I started to like, it went from 2 pages to 1 page, then a half a page, and then it actually came to 3 bullet points. And I could do a whole meeting. All I had was 3 bullet points, and I was able to kind of like build that skill to be able to link things together as I started talking. And
Mm-hmm.
I told him the story, and it got to a certain point where I had nothing prepared for the meeting whatsoever. And I was driving to the meeting, like, what am I going to say?
Mm-hmm.
And I looked up, and there was a billboard that had like some type of like phrase on it. And I said, I'll use that phrase as my beginning, and I'll take care of the whole meeting. I started with that
Wow.
phrase on the billboard. It had nothing to do with what I was going to talk about, mind you. But I was able to take that, relate it to something, and then go an hour and just talk for 1 hour. So I went from 2 pages of notes at 9 font to a billboard. And that bill and so that connection of over time, like you're saying, you have all those different experiences. You
Yep.
start connecting certain things. I've learned this here, and I learned that there, and all that. That's
Yes.
related. And pretty soon, it's like, oh man, now you have that's where 2 and 2 becomes 5, because you have so much reference point. You have so many reference points that now you can pull from that. Now you can relate. Now as a coach, now you can
Mm-hmm.
relate to different things. You're not so you don't have one. You don't have like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, now you have
Right.
a toolbox
Yes.
of things that you can use. So it's like, oh well, that's not going to the hammer's not appropriate for this lesson. It's a screwdriver. So I think that's really a good point, because once you do that, then you're able to kind of communicate better, and you're able to kind of connect with people in a more effective way, individually as a group, to be able to kind of have that rapport, so they can catch on to it. It's like, oh, okay,
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense. I got it. And when you have a
Yeah.
student who says that makes sense, oh, I got it, and they got it, then you did a good
Right.
job.
I think that just from listening to what you were saying there, something came to my mind. It almost sounded like the process of you going from afraid to speak to automation, if you want to call it automation, and on the fly and thinking on your feet. It almost sounds like you described the process of chunking. Um, like if you imagine when somebody learns how to drive a car and they get in the car and they've got their hands on this big wheel and they're, oh my God, this big wheel, this big wheel. And then whoever's teaching them how to drive says, here's the pedals. And then they forget about the wheel, and they go to the pedals. And then they say, but don't forget to check your mirrors. And now they don't see the pedals, the steering wheel, and all they see is the mirrors. And then over time, they start to link. I can do the feet and the wheel at the same time. I look in the mirror every 7 seconds. And before you know it, they're driving to work and don't even remember how they got there.
Yeah.
Taking something from unknown, afraid, and I could be exposed and look stupid in front of people to I couldn't even tell you what I did on the way to work today. I just automatically did it. And it sounds like the process of chunking the information. You were calling it connecting the information, but you were able to go from not knowing to absolute automation to the point where your trigger would just be a building or a quote on a billboard, and all of a sudden you were able to run with it because you were able to pull information at a speed that was lightning fast and present it in a way that you had so much knowledge base that you were able to do your 1 hour speak on that one trigger because you had all this knowledge and experience from different places. Whereas the guy that's shy and can't do it, he's just kind of like getting one skill at a time, and then he starts to build the momentum. And the more you work the process, you can get to that point from, they say in learning, have you ever heard the 4 processes of learning? You don't know, you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the, I don't know. No, you don't know, you don't know. Now you know you don't know, and you practice. Then you don't know but practice, and then you get to the final stage of you don't know that you know. So you go from complete don't know to absolute don't know how you do it. You just do it automatically. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because whether we know it or not, we're going through those 4 phases. It's just a matter of how you frame it. You know what I mean? And it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's important too to relay to students. It's like the trust, and it does take time. People get frustrated; they can't get it right. I mean, I know I was terribly frustrated when I was
Yeah.
learning a certain thing. Like I just want to get I just want to be good. Like I want to be able
Right.
to do this right.
Right.
And I think the older you get, the more you realize, okay, there is a process you have to go through, and you got to suffer a little bit. And that
Yes.
suffering is a good feeling, because look, if you're
Hmm.
suffering, that means you're progressing. As long as you're changing your approach, the goal stays the same, but you might have to like give a little bit of change and a little bit of adjustment on the way there, but you got to suffer through it, and that suffering does give you the fortitude,
Yeah.
and as you do that, you're building the skills and the acquisition of those skills to be able to do it later. And that's where it's like, okay, I think it's our responsibility too to be able
Hmm.
to take someone through that process. Don't get ahead of yourself. Stay in this phase here, like you
Hmm.
were saying. Let's focus on this phase, and let's stay here for a while until you master this. Then we'll move.
Yes.
Then because that's a math equation. You got to be able to add and subtract before you can divide,
Right.
multiply. So you got to be able to do the more complicated stuff. You could do, people, I will do the complicated stuff first. Well, you got to have everybody talks about the basics, and I think that's
Hmm.
I think it's so true, but it's like it doesn't mean anything anymore. It doesn't mean, I mean, like, oh, we have to do the basics first. Well, what does it actually mean? Like the
Right.
basics are that, like when I was teaching a throw the other day,
Hmm.
and it was a step pattern. It was a complicated step pattern. And these black belts, young black belts, they're teenagers, and they're like, they thought that was like the dumbest thing, because it was like a Thai sabaki, and they, oh,
Hmm.
this won't work, and they were real negative about it.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, guys, I'm like, I didn't invent this. Like this, I learned
Right.
this 8th-degree black belt. Okay, like this, some Japanese guy taught me this. So it was, I mean, it's been doing judo for like 700 years. I mean, like,
Right.
I'm not the master here. I'm just showing you what this guy showed me. And but it was a basic turn that had to be learned to do this one technique, and it had to be done over and over and over again to get that muscle memory, because it was so different than what they've learned, because they have enough experience.
Hmm.
Sometimes harder to train an experienced guy something new, like an old dog, new tricks type of thing, than his new guys. All the new guys got it quickly because they don't know any different. There's
Right.
no neuro pathways built in. They're learning for the first time. It was the black belts I had the most trouble with.
Yeah.
So it's like you almost have to go back to the beginning as a black belt and say, okay, let me just forget what I know and
Yep.
let me start over. And this is totally blank slate. This is new. And I think, with I personally try to do that now. I'm like, am I learn something? I want to be blank slate. I have a lot of experience, and I know that I have a lot of muscle memory and based on things, but I'm learning something new. It's like, And when I learn something new and it's difficult, it's like, now I know I'm learning something new because I'm building something. Like if you teach me jujitsu and you teach me a new technique, it's going to feel weird to me for a while. You know what I mean? Like I've
Oh,
done
absolutely.
parts, but I mean, I haven't done that particular technique. So it's like, it's going to be difficult. It's
Sure.
some time. You're going to be able to, do it really easily and quickly
Mhm.
and real smoothly. And I'll be like, okay, where do I put like you were saying with the car, right? Where do I put my hand? How do I do this? How do I do that? And
Yep.
so it's like that type of thing. So I think it's important to be able to, my point is, if you're experienced, to be able to clear the slate and go back to the beginning and look at it as a beginner.
Yes.
I think if you can do that over and over and over again, then you can continue to build your skills as you get older, much, much better.
And I think what ties into that is I think the black belt that you're talking about in general, they get comfortable knowing their set and they almost develop a closed mindset as a versus a open mindset, like the book Carl Dweck Mindset.
Mhm.
Um, Having a growth mindset keeps you in that curiosity phase. Like you're almost like, what does they say? Oh, I come into class, I'm a black belt, but I have eyes and ears like a white belt.
Mhm.
That's that same curiosity. Whereas when you're a black belt, you've already got styles and you get comfortable. And to go back to the start, like you just described, can almost be exposing for them because really it doesn't matter if you're a black belt when you are learning a new technique. There is a moment where you are a black belt, you are a white belt again. You are a vulnerable person learning a new skill, and those that are a growth mindset are just like very curious tend to do better than the rigid, oh, why are we doing this?
Mhm.
Why are we doing this? Don't worry about why you're doing this. Do you accept new information or do you not? Are you more closed minded and you're just sticking to polishing the good that you are? Or are you willing to learn and put yourself in that vulnerable state? And I was training this, I was working with, sorry, this white belt. And one day he'd come into the gym and he'd be doing really well and he'd be happy. Then another day he'd be coming into the gym and he'd be the nail and he'd be down. And I says, listen, I said, you're going to have good days and bad days. One day you're the hammer, one day you're the nail, and so on and so forth. I says, but you've got to reframe it. I said, the days that you're really, really good, that is a manifestation of all the rough days.
Mhm.
And I says, the day you're really good, that's not the day you got that good. That's just a manifestation of all the rough days you had before that. And I
Yeah.
said, your goal is to be as comfortable as you can in all of those rough days so that you can start to manifest more of the good days. And it's funny, my jujitsu coach just actually said to me yesterday, he said the rule of thirds. I said, well, what is the rule of thirds? He says, well, a third of the time it's going to suck. He said, a third of the time it's going to be okay. And he said, a third of the time it might be good.
Mhm.
He says if you can go in knowing that, and I'm talking about after you get through the honeymoon phase where I'm a judo guy, I'm coming 10 days a week. When you actually get past that and you're just like, judo's something that I'm going to be doing for a long time now. If you could just accept that it's going to be tough most of the time or a third of the time, it's going to be okay a third of the time, and a third of the time it might be good. It helps you reframe and know that it's okay. This is just a process. This is a wheel that comes and goes, the ebbs and flow. It's impossible to have good times every time. And anything that you do, usually you do your learning when you're being stretched. And when you're being stretched, you are uncomfortable. And it takes a lot of discipline and wherewithal. But at least if you know and understand, wow, this uncomfort is going to lead to better down the road. And if your goal is to get better, then you can be comfortable being uncomfortable, and I'm going to go in there today and be the nail. But I know that somewhere down the road, maybe it's going to be the tournament in 8 weeks. If I can be a nail for 6 of those weeks, and then start to change the last 2 weeks and start to become a little bit more of an equal and a little bit more of a hammer, you're going to peak at that competition, and you're going to be shot out of a cannon.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Versus, oh, I can't give up a fight. I can't give up a fight for 8 weeks. I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable. Then you go to the tournament and get your ass handed to you because you didn't put yourself in that uncomfortable phase where you were getting beat. Boxers do it all the time. They get beat up harder in the trainings. Mayweather's and the Manny Pacquiao's and the all the great fighters got beat up more in the practice room by all the sparring partners they brought in to beat them up and give them different looks. And then when they went to the fight was never as hard. Now imagine if all your training was always easy and you're always the hammer, and you go out there and see a guy you've never seen, and
Yeah.
you're like, holy shit, wasn't ready for that. Well, you can't handle it. You break as a person because you're used to being on Mount Rushmore, and you can only handle when things are good.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to give up that, and that takes discipline. And I think as a whole, I don't know as much for women, but man, we tend to have a certain amount of ego we got to put in check, and just know that if I'm not getting beat up in the training room at least a third of the time, at least, usually more than that, then I'm not really developing outside of a little comfort zone that I have in my own head. Like,
Yeah.
I'm really good at this position. I'm really good at this position, but you're not opening up your field of knowledge like we talked about, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Go and working out with the toughest guys in class, or maybe some guys have like you said, they have different skill sets and different techniques that you want to
Yes.
challenge, and you need to defend. You need to learn how to defend certain things.
Yes.
I mean, that's so if you're always fighting a weaker person, then your defense is going to be weak. You're not going to defend correctly.
Right.
And I mean, I remember I was in a training camp one time, and it was like Monday, and it was like a national training camp, and I was getting hammered. I was getting thrown. I was like, what is going on? I think Monday, Tuesday, by Wednesday, I'm like, wait, I gotta use my defense like what I learned as a kid, like like the correct
Yeah.
way. And as soon as I started doing that, I was able to block techniques that were really good, or decent. And I wasn't
Yeah.
getting thrown as much because before I could get away with, defending incorrectly because I was, you're strong enough, and the opponent weren't strong. But then you get a good guy, they're going to toss you. If you make one mistake, if you're out of position, you're going to get thrown. If you don't defend correctly, you're and properly, you're going to get killed. So it's like you adapt, right, to that type of that like you're saying, like you have different people, so you adapt to certain things like you mentioned before, which is like really powerful, which gives you a better game all around, because then
Yes.
you're able to defend certain things in certain ways because people have certain strengths and certain weaknesses, and you're kind of picking and choosing almost, which is kind of nice. And that's the open mindset, right? That's like the open,
Yeah.
hey, I
Yeah.
wanna get better. So give me the best guys the best guys, best women, doesn't matter who they are. If they're good, they're good. You're gonna learn.
Right.
You're gonna learn physically. You're gonna learn kinesthetically. You're gonna learn psychologically. All that stuff is gonna be super important, and that's how you get better.
Yes.
Um,
Do you
exposure.
ever hear do you ever hear the comment? I don't know if you've heard this quote. You do not rise to the occasion, but you do fall to the level of your training.
Yeah,
So with that being said, imagine two athletes where one athlete goes in and he's maybe good at throws. And he goes in every day and he knows he's the best thrower in their gym. And for 8 weeks, he goes in and he throws everyone and he throws everyone and he throws everyone. Now you have another athlete that is terrible when he's when he's side pinned in case of Katami, say, right? But he goes in every day and works on, okay, we're going to do Randori. I'm going to be in your case of Katami. And he works that for 8 weeks, right? And it doesn't matter what the two are doing. It's about the mentality. The
Mhm.
difference I feel between an average athlete and a high elite athlete is that guy will go into training and choose the worst place he can be in training and understand what it means overall.
Mhm.
So, for example, I struggle. I'm very good at being on top of people. When I get on top of you, I'm very good. Where I suffer is when there's a guy on top of me, 250 side pin, and he's got me locked down. I can't breathe and everything. It becomes my struggle. So on a Monday night, I work on side escapes.
Mm.
Do you think that's an exciting practice for me? No, because I'm getting dogged.
Mhm.
I'm getting the shit beat out of me. But I understand that once I get to the place where I desensitize myself from being unpinnable in
Mhm.
side control, then it is going to enhance my top game because now I can attack with more amplitude because I know if you turn me over into side control again, I can escape again. Now that takes a certain amount of mindset and fortitude to walk into the gym on a Monday when you could be working on your best move and looking great and beating
Mhm.
everybody, but you're choosing to say, okay, we're going to roll 4 times for 5 minutes. All right, where do you want to start? I want to be inside control. I want you to have me in case of Katami, and I want to try and escape for 5 minutes. And I get up and I can't breathe. Next one, same thing, same thing, same thing, until I start to figure out what I need to do, and then I can go learn the little bits and pieces. But after 8 weeks, that block has been taken care of.
Mhm.
Now, my 8 weeks may not have been great training. I'm getting dogged, but after 8 weeks, that's no longer a problem. So
Yeah.
now I had to go through that tunnel of death. And then on a Wednesday night, I might be working on throwing. So I balance my week out. I have one torturous night where I'm working on my worst skill.
Mhm.
Then I have something else that I'm trying to develop that I enjoy, which is throwing. And then say Friday night is open roll night where you put it all together and you just let training go where training goes. And
Yeah.
then Monday again, you're back in that shithole in the trenches, digging your way out of it again. So you've got your skill that you're working on to get better that you suck at. You've got your skill that you really enjoy and you're trying to add in, which would be my throws. And then you've got your free flowing night. And that's how you really balance it out, but you're addressing and choosing to go into the worst place you can go in training versus going in and saying, "Oh, I'm going to stick to the comfort zone." And we all have skills, like we all
Mhm.
have places where we excel at, and it's easy to go to that place. Like how many times when we go through the door after work, how many times do we sit on the couch, grab the remote control, get the slice of pizza, crack open the beer, and sit and watch 3 hours of television? You know why? Because it's the easiest, most convenient thing. How many people go home, change their clothes and go out and start digging trenches in their backyard and putting drain systems in or cutting their grass? But that in itself is developing. But the couch, what I'm getting at is that we're like water. We try to take the road of least resistance sometimes. And sometimes you have to force yourself into an area that's going to give you long-term success, not monetary pain. Because the
Mhm.
pain, you got to go through a certain amount of pain before you can get to that better level. And some people just they avoid that pain and go straight to what they're good at, and they sort of never really develop. But if they understand why you're going through the pain, like I said, I was teaching that guy that one day he'd be up, one day he'd be down. Well,
Yeah.
how about you walking out of training as the nail and saying, that really sucked tonight, but I understand the greater good of why.
Yeah.
Because in 8 weeks, nobody in the gym is going to be able to hold me. In 5 years, when all the new guys come in, they're not going to be able to pin me.
Yeah.
That's a dangerous guy right there. If he can keep repeating that process with his next new weakest thing, you're only as good as the weakest part and all that. That all comes into play. And then once you get that framework together and all that, then you can start employing mental skills that add to strategy. But you
Mhm.
can't really add strategy in before you've got a base of how to learn.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're sort of learning at a basic level, and then you can start going into strategy, and that gets into the NARD thing that we talked about, our OODA loops and everything like that. It's more strategy of using the skills you've already acquired.
Mhm. Yeah, it's funny. As you were speaking, I was thinking like, yeah, years ago, I developed. I wrote my second book, "Take Care Number One," so you don't step in number two.
Uh-huh.
Love that title. And I started to actually, I think, well, actually before the book, I developed a program that I was doing some speaking on,
Hmm.
and I wanted to become I wanted to become a speaker. That was one of my things, but I knew I wasn't that great at it. So what I did was I put something together, and I called up all the local libraries in the city of Pittsburgh, and I would just do free talks on like a Wednesday or Thursday night or something, whenever they would book me. And I would go there, and people would just show up, and I would just pretty much practice
Wow.
and just to do it, because it was really hard for me. Like it was something I wanted to get good at, but I knew if I didn't do it, I would never get good at it. And so I would just like, and my buddy would sit in the back, and then he would like grade me. He would, because I would pay him in beer at a bar afterwards. And so uh and I would do the talk on a Wednesday night or whatever it was, and then kind of some nights were better than others, and usually it was just very difficult and it was very challenging. And he would say, that was a B plus, that was a C, that was an A, that was a good. And he was really honest with me, which really helped, which is
Yeah.
kind of nice. But I kept doing that over and over and over again. And it got to a point where um, I was able to feel more comfortable and more comfortable and more comfortable and more comfortable. And it was nice because, like, after a while, it's like, okay, well, you gain confidence that way too. Like, kind of going back to what we said before at the other segment of this, is if you do it long enough, you're also going to gain the confidence because
Mhm.
you have the experience. So you're going to put yourself in those situations. So you use side control.
Yeah.
And I'm using this as an example,
Sure.
uh, personal example, is I use, forcing myself to public speak for free at libraries on a Wednesday nights in February when it's freezing, and just to practice, and just to, like, I wasn't marketing anything, I wasn't
Right.
selling anything, I was just wanted to give information because I wanted to practice that type of skill. And I knew I had to do that because there's no other
Yeah.
way to do it. You can't read it in a book. You have to
No.
do it.
Right.
You have to have somebody pin you in side control. You can't read a book and get out. It's impossible. So
Right.
to be able to kind of like put yourself in those situations, if it's in jujitsu in a side control position, or if it's in judo and in a throwing situation, or if it's in a business situation, meetings and things like that, uh, then you get better at it. And after a while, you get more comfortable and you gain more skills, and then you get more confidence, and then you're able to kind of execute better. And you're able to execute extemporaneously because you have to build the muscle memory and experience, and you're able to do it better and better and better. But to your point, if you don't put yourself in that situation and you don't suffer through that, there's no way in God's name you're going to be able to get better unless you force yourself to do that. Like, that's the trick. And I think I totally 100% agree with you. I think that's one of the best lessons that you can teach anybody, is just like, what makes you uncomfortable? What do you suck at? And let's put you in that situation and figure out a way to get you better at it. You get, if it's getting out or getting into a situation, or gaining a skill, or being able to perform in a job, or in the judo school, or in a jiu-jitsu school, or whatever you're doing in life, that
Yeah.
really, that process is painful, but at the very end, you really make a better person out of that person
Yeah.
as a coach. And individually too, you can, like you did it yourself, and
Yep.
like I did with the public speaking. So I think it's a great thing.
For anybody that's listening to this podcast, understand this. With regards to your example of public speaking, I would not suggest that they go to a library and have 50 people there and have somebody. I would say your first step might be drive up to the library and sit outside and visualize yourself walking into the library. And the next time it might be you're speaking to one person, because you have to have graduated pressure. I'm not suggesting you go in front of 50 people and bomb and then you're completely scarred and it becomes a phobia. Putting yourself under pressure it comes in process, and you have to build yourself up.
Ben, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate you jumping on this call because this has been really fun to